Oh, reminder, we need to get that deliverable done for the restaurant on Broughton.
The futurist restaurant in a historic district, right?
Well, it's the duality of it. It's pretty great, isn't it?
I guess it's kind of our theme for the year.
I mean, it's kind of like Dune in a way.
Oh, Dune. Dune, I think that it's one of these movies that I feel like there's so much symbolism behind it all, but I need some help like understanding all the nuances because I feel like I'm getting only like 50% of it all. There's like so much. I mean, of course, it's visually striking.
So this movie basically boils down to a bunch of rivalries. These two great houses rivaling one another. It's the Atreides versus the Harkonnens. But even beyond that, it's nature versus technology. It's sheer quality versus very stark opaqueness. It's angular and versus organic. It's history versus the future.
Future? Mm-hmm. Is there an actual time frame to this movie?
Yeah, so supposedly it's set 10,000 years in the future, and it's this kind of like post-technological world. So it is supposed to...
I totally didn't get that. I thought that this was kind of like almost a period piece.
There's all of these different elements that are kind of at play, and you can see that all of the costumes have different historical references. Like the Atreides costume, she pulled from all of these different royal houses from the past. And then you see some really interesting things with like Lady Jessica's costumes that are flowing in the wind when she gets
I love that costume. The sheer one, right? Like completely covered. Almost like she became part of that landscape in a way. I thought that was visually...
If you think about it, that's kind of how sand dunes appear in a way. Like even though when you look
like
at
a
dune,
sandstorm, right? When it moves. I think there's a few scenes in there I remember that's kind of like you just see like almost like a wall of sand that moves and it creates almost like a veil over the whole frame, whether it's like architecture or the character. I'm sure that there's some kind of character defining.
Just to frame it a little bit more for you, and so the Atreides family, they are almost like the good guys in this movie in a way. They have this kind of openness and this transparency.
So their characteristic itself is very welcoming in a way, right? Yes. So maybe of course it's still a colonizing kind of family, but
they're trying to learn more from the planet. And so I think that the way that they've been framed, even with costumes, is kind of to have this like sense of softness and openness. But if you think of the Harkonnens, they're very like
menacing.
They're very menacing. Everything is about like profit and efficiency. They have this secretive quality. Definitely
like there's something that is they're hiding.
And all of the costumes and the architecture and sets around them kind of reflect that, because all of those are those very kind of plasticky, super opaque sets and buildings, and even their costume design, everything is very like hard and opaque, and it's pretty much in direct contrast to the House Atreides.
I guess this idea of transparency and opacity, I did notice too in the architecture itself. The Atreides, when they were in their original planet
on Caladan.
Yeah. There's a lot of openness to daylight and windows, versus all of Harkonnen sets are kind of closed in, no windows, kind of windowless, and very much about these almost like bunker-like kind of quality. The Atreides, I feel like there's a lot more connection with nature, in a way more integrated with nature, right?
I feel like that's a theme throughout the entire movie, is this man versus nature. And if you kind of think about it, mankind is a little bit more rigid and kind of imposes itself onto whatever landscape and brings that rigidity in.
Well,
and nature's much more organic.
You can see that. I remember even when the Atreides come to, what's the planet
Arrakis.
For the Fremen? Arrakis. Even with the sand dunes and how it's all ultra-organic, the architecture is these like pyramid-like...
It's like a ziggurat-inspired.
Very, very orthogonal, very angular.
Very imposing on the natural landscape.
I guess it's not new. Like clearly that's the thing that is interesting about this movie, but pyramids do exist, you know, as one of the most like antiquity form of architecture that exists to this day. And it is on these desert sand dunes, and how these imposing, almost like pure geometry sort of clunked onto the nature piece of it all.
And then in complete contrast to that, the Harkonnen planet, where you've got everything's black and white. So everything there, the planet itself is very stark, but all of their architecture is a little bit more organic in a way.
Oh, I remember that building that I mentioned kind of remind me of the TWA terminal in New York, right? Speaking of, I feel like that's kind of an interesting thing to think about, because the TWA and all of the architecture sort of around that era, where it's the modernist architecture, where it's the architect's vision of the future at that moment. So you have the TWA Hotel, you have a bunch of other buildings that almost is like what Zaha Hadid is doing in current time, also kind of evoking the idea of machine and futuristic.
You have the kind of futuristic buildings of Planet Harkonnen, but then you have also these buildings that, even though they're futuristic, they have this like sense of brutalism, which is almost more grounded. It's not super futuristic.
Well, the one thing that I remember clearly, because I recognized the building right away, which was the Koloscapa building that they used for that Princess
Irulan.
Yes. It's again another way that they sort of anchor history into it. Koloscapa himself, because of his location and working in Italy with a lot of historic structure, the way that he works and thinks about is how the details of his modern intervention interact with history. So how do you respect it but still make it part of kind of his today life, you know?
I feel like that's exactly what production design of Dune is doing. Other science fiction movies and like into the future movies are doing, it's usually this very like fully white, sleek, techie type environment. But what Dune is doing that relates to that is that they're creating the future with historical references. So they're creating the future out of the past, which creates this...
I don't think that any future will exist in a vacuum, right?
Exactly.
Like you can't just erase the past completely.
There's some sort of history that needs to be built upon to make it seem like it is one of these long-standing, these ancient houses.
Right. That's why I feel like I love working in historic structures, because there's like so much story that you can build upon. Just like we said, like there's no, like the future doesn't exist in a vacuum. Like it stems from something. So to kind of find that story and to find that sense of place, and that's why I think that I was slightly confused in the beginning of where the timeline of this is, because it isn't what we are used to in terms of a futuristic kind of aesthetic, right? Because it's always about these like ultra minimal screens everywhere, technology everywhere.
And I think that's what Dune has brought, this element of soulfulness into a futuristic movie, which
it feels like it has roots. Whenever we say the word minimalist, whenever we say the word modern, whenever we say the word contemporary, even the word futuristic, I think everybody directly goes to the ultra stark, ultra white, super clean, sharp, and then they blame it to be too cold, not human, not warm. But I think that this movie actually kind of proved that futuristic can still be human, can still be warm, can still be tactile. So to me, I feel like this whole thing about these contradictory and contradiction, the tension between old and new, the tension between angular and organic, the tension between fluid versus sharp, or even transparency versus opacity. All of these tension, I think, is what makes design so multidimensional. You would never just take something and copy it completely. You will kind
Or-
of bring whatever is current or new into it. So then that creates like the new version of whatever that is, the more contemporary version. And I think that that's what our job is about, is to see how we can start to evolve and progress heritage and history.
Well, it sounds like Dune was a great inspiration for you after all, for our futurist restaurant in the historic district.
I guess so. I guess so. Follow and subscribe to Studio THO on YouTube. You definitely don't want to miss this. Happy THOing.